Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to June on the Range 2025. This is Michael K. Vaughan's beloved BookTube event, one of many that he's created, celebrating Westerns, Western novels, and Western short stories. I have had a great June on the Range for 2025, but my June on the Range hit a massive, unavoidable detour in the last week, and there's only a day left, so I don't think I'm going to be able to pull it out of that tailspin. So the bulk of my June on the Range for 2025 is now on the books, unfortunately. I might read another Western tonight, but I'm kind of on deadline tonight, so I might not. So I wanted to give, just in case this is my send-off video for June on the Range 2025, I wanted to give it a proper send-off. I found a lot of authors this time around that I didn't know about. I read a lot of things that I thought were really interesting. Had a really good June on the Range before it took a nosedive in the last week. But one of the pleasures, the real standout pleasures of June on the Range 2025 for me involved one of the very loose guidelines that you have for the event itself. The guidelines are to read one Zane Grey novel and one Louis L'Amour novel, because they are widely and I think accurately viewed as the architects of the modern iteration of the genre. And I read a Zane Grey novel that was not only not what I expected, but very good. Maybe the best thing, the biggest surprise for this June. But I hadn't yet read a Louis L'Amour novel. And I didn't know quite what to make about that, because there has been at least one June on the Range where Louis L'Amour threatened to take over my reading completely, because he's just that good. And I've mentioned that in a few videos, and people have said, well, you know, I read a book of his, and I mean, it was okay, but I don't see what you're seeing. So I thought for today's June on the Range, I don't know if I'll make one tomorrow, but for today's June on the Range, I thought I would give a little demonstration of what I'm talking about. And it will either show you what I mean, or you're not going to see what I mean. It's from Louis L'Amour's 1957 novel, Silver Canyon. There with a terrific umber cover there. This came out in 1957. It was a rapturous hit. Everybody loved it. It's been reprinted at least 30 times. It's probably still in print. All sorts of commemorative editions and whatnot. It's a fairly familiar story. It's a familiar story even to Louis L'Amour fans. A familiar story even to the one Louis L'Amour novel that I reread in June on the Range this year, where a man comes into possession of a ranch and has to fight for it. Has to fight for this thing that he didn't even know existed a few weeks ago, against the bad guys of the territory, all while finding true love. And I thought, instead of going into great detail, I would read you the beginning of chapter 1 of Silver Canyon. I wasn't planning on this, but when I was reading it, I was rereading the novel last night, and I was thinking, boy, if you're looking for a demonstration of what Louis L'Amour magic is, you don't need to look much further than the first page or two of this book. So I thought, instead of going into great detail about a novel that not all of you have read, or that most of you won't read, that I would read you that beginning to see if the Louis L'Amour magic actually announces itself to you. So this is chapter 1, at the beginning of chapter 1, because I don't want to get into any copyright trouble with the Louis L'Amour estate. I don't want to do that. If I didn't think that they cared, or if I thought that they approved of June on the Range, I'm sure if they knew about June on the Range, they would approve. If I thought that it would approve, I would read an entire Louis L'Amour novel out loud to you, so we could really hunker down with every paragraph. But instead, we'll just read the first part of the first chapter. I rode down from the high blue hills and across the brush flats into Hatton's Point, a raw bit of spawning hell scattered hit or miss along the rocky slopes of a rust-topped mesa. This was the country for a man, a big country to grow in, a country where every man stood on his own feet and the wealth of a new land was his for the taking. Ah, it's a grand feeling to be young and tough, with a heart full of hell, strong muscles, and quick hands, and the feeling that somewhere in the town ahead there's a man who would like to cut you down to size with hands or gun. It was like that, Hatton's Point was, when I swung down from my buckskin. A new town, a new challenge, and if there were those who wished to try my hand, let them come and be damned. I knew the raw whiskey of this town would be the raw whiskey of the last, but I shoved open the bat-wing doors and walked to the bar and took my glass of rye and downed it, then looked around to measure the men at the bar and the tables. None of them were men whom I knew, yet I had seen their likes in a dozen towns back along the dusty trails I'd been riding since boyhood. The big, hard-eyed rancher with the iron-gray hair who thought he was the cock of the walk, the lean, keen-faced man at his side with the careful eyes who looked to be a quick gun slick and fast as a striking snake. And there were the others there, men of the western melting pot, all of them looking for the pot of gold, and each of them probably a man to be reckoned with, but no one of them ready to admit himself second best to any, and me among them. I remembered then that my old dad had told me, back in the hills where I ate my first corn pone, "See it, lad, live it. There'll never be its like again, not in our time, nor any other." He'd been west. He'd seen it growing out of the days of Bridges and Carson, seen the days of fur change to the days of buffalo, and finally to the days of beef cattle. He sent me west in my teens and told me I'd have to walk tall and cut a wide swath. The big man with the iron-gray hair turned to me as a great brown bear turns to look at a squirrel. "Who sent for you?" There was harsh challenge in the words, the cold demand of a conqueror, and I laughed inside me. His voice lifted me to recklessness, for it was here, the old pattern I'd seen before in other towns, far back down the trail. Nobody sent for me. I let a fine insolence come into my voice. I ride where I want and stop when I wish. He was a man grown used to smaller men who spoke respectfully, and my reply was an affront. His face went cold and still, but he thought me only an upstart then. "Then ride on," he said. "You're not wanted at Hatton's Point." "Sorry, friend, I like it here. Maybe in whatever game you're playing, I'll buy some chips." That's how the chapter starts. And I know it's an old cliche, but I can't imagine anyone willingly stopping at that point. That's the first 2 pages. That's the first 2 type pages in a mass market paperback. About the first page in a full-size hardcover. And that first page, that first 2 pages in a mass market, that first little gulp of the book, of any book, once upon a time, for decades and decades, was regarded as the entrance point, the business card. The book has to have forward momentum going all the way, famously, to page 112, but it has to be irresistible for that opening part, or what's the point? The people who are browsing it in a bookstore are going to open it and start reading. They are not going to turn to page 112 or to the end, God forbid. They're going to start reading then. Now, Louis L'Amour knew that, as well as anybody else did. His publishers were experienced men. They knew that as well. And so you might say that the whole thing is freighted for that. I would beg to differ. There's no fat anywhere on a Louis L'Amour novel, usually. But for that opening, for that calling card of the book itself, I can't imagine anyone stopping reading. And that's not true of Zane Grey, for instance, even in his what I have the 3 best books by him that I've read. And it is almost exclusively down the road not true to that extent for any of the other Western writers that I've been reading. If it isn't unique to Louis L'Amour, I think it certainly stands out for him. So I wanted to share a little bit of that with you for June on the Range. Now, tomorrow is the end of June on the Range, so either I will have a Western to talk about on my way out the saloon door, the Batwing doors, or I'll just do an overview of the month. I don't think there's really no way to get back in the saddle after I've lost a week, but that's okay, because it was a great event until then. So I'll wrap this up for now, and we will meet tomorrow. Thank you.